In this lesson, we'll work on getting our particles to interact with the floor of our scene. Okay, so we have our aircraft. It is looking pretty good. So we have particles that are emitting. Everything is looking, for the most part, pretty nice. But as we mentioned at the end of our previous lesson, one thing that is very obviously wrong with this scene is the fact that our particles are just passing right through the floor of this landing pad. So whenever we create any sort of particles or anything like that in 3ds Max, by default, they won't interact with anything. We actually have to go in and specify which objects, if any, should be affected or interacting with these particles. Okay, so let's come in and we'll switch over to our Create panel, and we're going to go into our Space Warps. Now in here, we're going to pull this down. We can start to add any kind of forces to these particles that we may want to. So we can add push forces to these particles. We can start to drag or pull them in a certain direction. We can add gravity to these particles, wind, anything like that. So in this case, we don't necessarily need any of these forces, but if you had things like smoke that was rising, any sort of fog, or some other types of effects, you may need to come in here and add these types of forces. And you can add these forces in exactly the same way that we're about to add another type of effect, which is called deflectors. So when it comes to deflectors, this is what we're going to use to control the interaction between particles and other objects in the scene. So here we have something like a omniflect. So we have a P, which is a planar omniflect. In a sense, it's just a plane that gets dropped into your scene that acts as a bouncing object or a reflecting object for your particles. We also have a spherical omniflect and a universal omniflect. And when it comes to deflectors, we have universal, a spherical, and then just a regular deflector. Now in my case, I'm going to use what's called a universal omniflect. And the reason I like to use a universal is because we can actually, instead of just using a stand-in shape, we can actually drop in this universal and then actually pick an object that we want to act as our floor. So this U omniflect, we can really place this anywhere we want in our scene. It doesn't matter. So maybe press the T key to switch to a top view, and I'll just sort of place this out here. Okay, again, doesn't really matter where we place it. Now with this selected, let's go to our Modify panel. And this, again, is where this universal omniflect becomes really nice, because now we can just go and pick object, and we'll just pick the floor. And now you can see the platform base is going to act as our collider, essentially. So press the P key to jump back to my perspective view. Now, even though we've set this as our collision object, you notice these particles are still passing right through. So in addition to setting up an object as a collider, now we actually need to tell the particles to interact with that collider. So let's come in, and we're going to use this link or bind to space warp. Let's click on that. Let's click on our particles, and we're going to drag those over to this omniflector. Okay, now you can see something started to happen. So now our particles are actually hitting this surface and bouncing up. Now that's not exactly what we're looking for either, so let's come back to our selection. Let's go back to our omniflector. Let's come in and take a look at some of these parameters down here. Right now we have our bounce. Right now it's set to 1, which means it's essentially going to act like a completely elastic surface. In our case, we probably don't want that. So let's take our bounce and probably bring that down to 0. So that way, as our particles hit that surface, they just sort of scatter out. That's probably a little bit more realistic as far as this kind of a smoky, sort of a cold steam effect. Very nice. So let's come in here, make sure that everything is still good. Now we still have a few of these particles that are sort of passing through here. Now the reason for that is, if we take a look at this omniflector, right now it's set to begin having some sort of an effect at frame 0, but at frame 100 the effect of this omniflector stops. Now we have a few of these particles that exist beyond frame 100, so let's take our time off and kick that up a little bit higher, maybe to about frame 120, so that way we can make sure that as long as our particles live, this omniflector is having an effect. There we go, much better. Okay, very nice. Now one thing that we may want to do is with this super spray Now you can see whenever we select the super spray, this omniflector shows up as something that is being affected or is influencing this. So let's come down to our super spray. And one thing I might want to do is, looking at this, I find that maybe our particles are getting just a little bit too long of a life. So at this point, now that we sort of see what this looks like with our collider, let's come in here, and I might try to take this life, maybe set that down a little bit lower to about maybe 10 frames. That looks a little bit better. And I'll go ahead and take this fade for 10 frames. I'll try to still maybe keep this on here, but maybe let that be a little bit lower of an impact, so that way they only fade down for about 3 frames. There we go. So I think that should work out pretty nicely. Okay, so now we have our particles looking much nicer, much more realistic as far as the overall behavior of these. So now at this point, we're ready to come in and start adding some shading to these particles. So we have these particles set up. If we were to actually come in and render this out and see what this looks like, we can see now our particles are being rendered out, these nice sort of billboard particles. Now we need to come in and actually make these look like some sort of a smoke or fog or sort of a cold steam effect. So we're going to work on coming in and shading and texturing and rendering our particles starting in our next lesson.